Everyone, I hope you're doing well. I'm just waiting for Dennis to join us here. I just see him on Slack. It's nice to see all of you. Some of you I've talked to very recently.
Hello.
Hey, Dennis, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you?
Are you drinking water or whiskey?
I'm drinking. It's one of them is correct, but I'm actually drinking two things right now. So I'm drinking water and some coffee.
Okay.
5 p.m. So
that's right, 5 p.m. Well, yeah, I went upstairs and got some whiskey because I was just like, it's 6 o'clock where I'm at, so it's happy hour.
Perfect time for whiskey.
Yeah, and most people who know me know that I'll show up to events like this with whiskey regardless.
That's awesome.
Cool. It looks like people are starting to roll in. I'll keep an eye on people and admit them to the waiting room. But I want to do this Q&A because I've been getting a ton of questions about Mem, obviously having created a YouTube channel, a course about this, and I've been, very fortunate to get to spend a bit of time interacting with you. I don't know, just so you guys know, Dennis is probably not only one of the most humble startup founders I've met, but also a guy who will literally on Christmas Eve help you solve technical support issues. I don't know anybody who would do that. Literally, he made me correct the email that went out. He's like, hey, make sure you say that I'm the co-founder, not the founder. And that's entirely on me because I wasn't sure who was the other co-founder. But yeah, well, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about why you started Mem, kind of your background and like what prompted all this, and then we'll just open it up to Q&A because I think there are a ton of questions for sure. And for questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and Dennis and I, I'll queue them up as Dennis asks them, and we can do some screen shares and stuff.
Yeah, perfect. Cool. First of all, thanks for having me. Obviously, really excited to be here and always happy to solve problems that we cause, even if it's on Christmas Eve and all of that.
Well, that one was on me, believe it or not. Remember,
yeah, I'm the one who caused that. I think we've caused our fair share of problems. So, thank you for being an early adopter, obviously. Yeah, a little bit about Mem's founding journey. Like, why did we start this to begin with? I think I'd be remiss to not really begin with my relationship with my co-founder. So Kevin, and Kevin's the other co-founder of Mem. We've known each other for the last 9 years. And we met in our freshman dorms and in college and have basically became best friends really quickly. He actually hated me at first. He thought I was an asshole. This is a side story for another day. Became really good friends. He pulled me into a lot of the computer science, a lot of things around that. And then we just, started. One of the cornerstone pieces of our relationship was just we would always be building something. And we always were exploring different ideas, whether there was one, which was, we realized that we actually weren't going to class very often. And we did the math in terms of our tuition and how often we went to class. And we realized, wow, we're paying a few $100 per class and we're not even going to those things. I ended up deciding to build an app called Go to Class that ended up never launching. But it was basically the concept around that was every time we would go to class, it'd be like a kind of a group model where every time anyone would go to class, they would get paid from the group. And if you skipped class, then you'd pay into the pool that would then be distributed to everyone else. And it was this kind of like social incentive model, but that was just like one of countless things that we would build together. And one of the things throughout the years that we kept coming back to, and there were so many different things between it, was just along this thread of information and knowledge management. One of the earliest things that we built was, I don't know if you guys know, there's like a game on Wikipedia where basically it's starting from any random page in Wikipedia, how many clicks will it take you to get to any other random page or a specific page? And the number is actually 7 at the most, right? So to get from any page to any page, it will take no more than 7 clicks. And actually, in most times, it'll take less than that. And we thought that was really interesting because Wikipedia is essentially the world's knowledge graph, and being able to actually identify programmatically the shortest distance between any two things could actually provide some really interesting results in terms of, if the shortest path from Apple to remote work is 3 hops, what are actually those 3 hops And does that say actually something interesting about the relationship between Apple and remote work and about the world knowledge graph? But so that was one of the early things that we thought about and worked on. And then we built a little prototype of it. We weren't really thinking of commercializing anything there. We were just hacking around for fun. We lived in this 10-foot by 10-foot apartment in our freshman summer in this like co-living space in San Francisco where the Wi-Fi would basically never work. So we would always go over to this pizza shop next door called Extreme Pizza in Soma in San Francisco, where the Wi-Fi was reliable and we would just work on random things. So that was one of the things, but also in that summer is when we actually started talking about, this is back in 2014, we started talking about this concept of there's so much information that we actually generate today. Our digital footprints are just so massive. Because if I were to give anyone my phone and I said, hey, tell me exactly what I'm doing right now and like all of the context, what I did today, what my state of mind is, everything, they would probably be able to actually do that very accurately. And we thought it was crazy that despite that being true, that the tools that we used actually knew so little about us. And essentially every time we open an app, it started from a completely blank slate, as if it had no context about who we were, what we were thinking, we actually wanted to do. And the end state of technology really is you want to live in a world where information just flows, right? Where some behavior that you do in one context is completely transferable to a different context. And that was one of the things that like we discussed that summer along this thread, and it just kept coming back over the years. This concept of, hey, why is it that despite more and more information being available today, that so little of it is actually connected? And then ultimately, I won't bore you with the entire set of things that we ended up doing. It was like dozens of random things, and sprinkled in between these things, one of it was always coming back to this idea of information flow. I ended up going to Yelp for 2 years as a PM after I graduated, and he went to Google for 2 years, but we would jump on this call every week to catch up as friends, but inevitably we would always come back to the discussion of, hey, what are we doing and when? And we talked about so many different spaces, but at the end of the day, it was just very clear to us that we kept coming back to this space. And really, it's just this problem of why is the information that we have today so useless? Really, I think, that's probably the best way to describe it. Why is it so useless to us? Why can't we actually have, and this is one of the key concepts that we talk about a lot, what does data ownership actually mean? Data ownership doesn't actually mean throwing away your data into cold storage, making sure that nothing can ever, access it. Data ownership means it means portability, meaning I can actually decide who and what has access to my data and when. And it means privacy, but it doesn't mean completely cold storage such that no one can access it. So the way that we that was one of the core concepts that we kept coming back to. And in July of 2019, decided it was time to go and start this company, exploring this kind of general space. And one of the first things that we landed on, having spent 2 years both at big companies, was we realized that it was just neither of us, believe it or not, were previously big note takers. Like we actually just never wrote anything down. And for me, it was because I had tried many times in the past, but every time I tried, it would just end up being completely useless. It would end up in like Apple Notes, and it would end up in my email drafts. And I would, spend all this time writing down this information. And then when the time actually came for when I actually needed it, I realized that there was no way I would actually be able to find what I was looking for. And
okay, let me stop you really quick. Quick question for everybody. Anybody else have that challenge where you can never find what you're looking for? Just go ahead and type yes in the chat box, because I saw that come up in my survey data over and over again. Cool. Yeah, just go ahead and type in the chat. We'll open it up to questions shortly. Okay, cool. All right, awesome.
Sweet. Right. Yeah. And that's the first area that we just decided to start looking into. And now 2.5 years later, pretty much working on the exact same problem, obviously with a much more refined kind of statement and viewpoint on what we're doing. And that's essentially, we're building a self-organizing workspace. And the thesis is there's so much information out there. Knowledge workers spend the vast majority of their time actually just maintaining this information and spending way more time organizing than actually exercising
doing work,
your creativity, doing work. And it's just even crazier in a team setting. And that's Yeah, so that's what we're working on. I think our belief is that everyone else in this space is working on the wrong thing, where everyone else is figuring out a way to make it so that you can customize your folder structure in a more interesting way, or you can create some interesting organization in this way. But really, I think 90% of the world, what people just want is, hey, I just want to be able to find the thing I need when I actually need it. I actually want to spend as little time as possible customizing and adding all of this organization.
Yeah. I honestly, like, this is when I sent the email out, I said, like, the thing people are probably going to want to know is what makes Mem so different. And I think I don't know how early on I was from your launch. I was pretty early. Like, I was trying to
when did you join? What was I
was trying to see, at this point, there's 5,000 Mems. So I was trying to figure out where I have I'm pretty close to 6,000. Cause I remember even Kevin was like, how many Mems do you have? I was like, a shitload. Yeah. And he was like, how many is a shitload? I was like, 5,000 or 6,000. He was like, I have 20,000. I'm like, you work at Mem. So that's unfair. But
also we have a lot of test Mems. So that's not a fair comparison.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think question was, I was a diehard Notion guy for probably until I discovered you guys, and I was like, oh my God, I'm like, no more, because I honestly felt that Notion failed to live up to one promise, which was like, oh, this is supposed to be distraction free. The notifications drove me crazy. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, this is not distraction free. I'm getting distracted by the very thing I've been trying to avoid. And no knock on them. They built a great product. One big issue for me was I would do free writing. I read 1,000 words a day, and I would have a section just for free writing. And half the time I couldn't find the thing. I was like, oh, I wrote this thing. How am I ever going to be able to use it? I'm sure there's probably tens of thousands of words that I've captured inside of Notion that I will probably never see the light of day. What's this question? Like, what is it, that makes Mem so different? Because I think the whole idea of self-organizing sounds amazing. And at the same time, because I was actually talking, I did the first, lecture, re-recorded it for the course. And I'm like, this is actually the hardest thing for people to put their heads around, because
totally.
What do you mean it's self-organizing? I've been organizing things in linear structures my entire life.
Yeah. So I think that there's a few things. So one of the really interesting things is I don't think this actually what we're building right now would have been possible to build even 3 years ago. And I think part of the thing is, it's interesting because today in technology, the hot topic that everyone's talking about is obviously it's crypto. But one of the things that I think has flown under the radar for the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, even though it was really hot back earlier in the decade, is artificial intelligence, right? And I think what people saw was there was this, whole wave of artificial intelligence companies that came out in the early 2010s and got everyone excited. And then people started trying out the applications and using them and realized, oh, wait a second, this actually doesn't work. This works maybe 80% of the time, but in order for these things need to work 99.9% of the time in order for it to truly be valuable. Otherwise, we just end up in this uncanny valley. I think people stop paying attention to it. And inevitably, I think one of the really interesting things about technology cycles is when people stop paying attention to something after a hype cycle is when the real work actually gets done. And the incredible over the past, really, I would say 2 years, but really it's 6 months. We've just seen some incredible developments in terms of how effective AI is today, and for startups specifically. Whereas previously it was only accessible to large companies who could build multi-billion-dollar AI teams, but now you have vendors like OpenAI who are essentially democratizing this technology. So I think one of the first and foremost, one of the really interesting things about what we're doing, and Srini, there's some stuff that you probably see in the product today, which makes you think, wow, this is just better than everything else. But it's 5% of what you're about to see in the next few months, and that's a really exciting stuff.
I'm glad you brought up that whole idea of AI, because I think AI is really misunderstood by people who are not developers. Like I have a friend who's literally the friend who I did the Mem call consultation for just the other day. That video I sent you was an AI engineer. And I'm like, you're an AI engineer. You of all people have no excuse for such a piss poor workflow. But I think that one thing I remember there's a tool called LogoJoy. I think they're called Looka now. And I remember the first time I tried it, I was like, this logo is a piece of crap. Then I tried it about 2 years later, and I was like, oh my God. And I realized what it was is, they have enough data points now that the AI actually works. But I think that, people misunderstand AI, like even something like Zapier is an AI. And so why don't you put this into like average sort of knowledge workers terms for somebody like me or somebody else? Like, I only understand because I have friends who build all this stuff. And so I was really fortunate to learn from them. Like my friend Gareth runs this Airtable automation company. And I was like, oh, I understand how automation works. But I think I even was telling you yesterday, like trying to explain automation at the lowest level, I was like, you flip a light switch and it turns on the light bulb. Because I think people, when they think AI, are thinking algorithms and robots and all this other nonsense. Break it down to the most basic level so that way, and then we'll open this whole thing up to questions.
Yeah, I'll try to do my best here. But basically, I'll just explain, for example, how we're using it. So let's say you take any mem, right? Or any, let's simplify it, any text document. There's a way to essentially transform that text document into a series of numbers that represent the semantic meaning. So it represents, so let's say there's a statement. It's, I was at the riverbank. And there's another statement, which is, I went to the bank ATM, right? So both of those statements have the word, but they clearly mean very different things. And I think that's probably one of the hardest challenges that people have been trying to solve. And nowadays, what the technology that actually exists, essentially what it does is it allows you to transform that sentence into a series of numbers. And each of those numbers represents some form of like semantic meaning. One of those numbers will represent, oh, this is whether or not this is about a person. And another number will represent whether or not this is about whether this is let's say whether this is a country or whether this is a location, whatever. And so you have these series of numbers. And essentially what we can do nowadays is you can actually, by transforming these sentences and these documents into numbers, now you can essentially just say, okay, cool. What is the distance between this document and this document? And the closer it is in distance, the closer in semantic meaning it is. We've lived in this world where every search query that you've ever typed before is all very like keyword driven. That's what Google has taught us over the last 20 years. It's, hey, if you want to search for something, you type a keyword and then you use that. And that's how we've been trained to think. But that's not actually how our brain naturally thinks, right? Our brain, because a lot of times we don't remember the keyword. The way we think is like, oh, what was that book that Srini recommended in December? Like, that's how we think. And being able to actually convert that question into the same vector space, but basically into the same series of numbers, and then finding the closest thing to that and being able to then surface, oh, by the way, it's this is the book. Yeah. That's fundamentally what this like new technology is doing. So at the end of the day, it feels like magic. And I think one of the most misunderstood parts of all of this is it's like people are like, oh, Facebook, they always surface ads to me of the thing that I just talked about. They're clearly listening. And it's actually just not true at all. And what's really happening is essentially these series of algorithms and these numbers that's happening, and it's just producing these results. So
yeah. So one question I have for everybody here is, as I told you, I didn't know if you saw the video, but I remember I just showed one of my friends one of your features, and he looked at me and he said, I feel like you've upgraded my life. He said, I spend 40% of my day moving information from one place to another. And it was with Mem Spotlight. I was like, seriously? I'm like, I cannot believe this is how you work. And and of course I have like thousands of data points to draw from because of the nature of the work that I do. And I think part of the reason I took to Mem was I was like, I deal with so much more information than the average person between hosting a podcast, the YouTube channel, reading hundreds of books. I'm like, but what I realized, you mentioned this, like I realized you allow us to externalize our associative networks from our brain. Everything is associated. So the example I gave was in the article I wrote about the disadvantaged folders. If those who haven't read it, I'll put a link in here. But they said, if you say the word high school prom, like actually, let's just do this as an exercise. What's the first thing that comes to mind? If I say the word prom, just put it in the chat because I'm really curious. I didn't get to go to my prom, but I was a total geek in high school. Not that I'm still not. Okay, so it's interesting. And I bet you, if you look like suit, high school, date, dance, and I bet you any one of you can recall details
of all of those events very easily. Give me just a sec. My headphones. All right. And that's the thing I think that is so striking about
is it basically mirrors the process of the way that you think. And it's just like, I remember my friend said, he's oh my God, he was like, this allows me to organize information exactly the way that I think. And it's so counterintuitive to the way that we've done things for so long. Like, I remember the first time I showed one of my friends just a little bit, you're going to be able to write your next book so fast. I'm like, yeah, that doesn't mean the book will be good. There's still going to be a lot of work to do. Like, what I realize is because Cal Newport has been going on and on about the Zettelcast on his podcast. And after the last, I've been having this conversation, and I was like, all right, I have an idea. I'm going to write an article titled "Why Cal Newport is Flat Out Wrong About the Zettelcast Method," because I don't think he understands it. Like, I think, and it's funny, either he interpreted it differently, but yeah, and you notice how quickly each one of you came up with words that you associate with that one word, just prom. And I bet you if I asked, any one of you could recall details. And the funny thing is that what I've been seeing with Mem is that we can do that now with knowledge, and we can externalize associative networks in a way that we never could. How many of you spend a lot of time moving information around, copying and pasting from one place to another? And how many of you would say that takes up a ton of time in your day? Even though it seems small, but it just adds up over time. Just, type in yes, and then we'll actually, Shelby all day. Okay. Dan, I just talked to Dan, actually. We were having a chat. So Dan has a lot of questions for you. It's ones that I couldn't answer. I was like, we're talking to Dennis. So yeah, I'll have him answer those. All right. So turns out that this is a very common problem. Before I open it up to questions, obviously I am like a diehard super fan. I started a damn YouTube channel about Mem, which I had no intention of doing that. It was just like, and funny enough, it was the result of a thought. Literally, that the reason that I started that YouTube channel was based on a conversation I had 6 years ago on the Unmistakable Creative. And it was for the guy who actually created Evernote's first documentation. His name was Brett Kelly. He wrote an ebook called Evernote Essentials. Chris Guillebeau was one of our podcast guests, wrote about that in his book and was like, this guy built an entire career off of somebody else's company. And I'm like, okay, I'm doing this all day anyways. Maybe I should create some tutorials about it. And one thing led to another. It's, I guess I could create a course about it too. But anyways, let's open this up to questions, because I think that was the whole point of this. And now that you and I have talked, let's open it up. Whether you want to be on camera or you just want to pop it in the chat, let us know. You know what? Let's do this. Let's open it. What is it that makes Mem different from so many of the other apps that people use? Because I mean, I'm sure a lot of people here probably, actually let us know. What do you currently use to manage information?
Yeah. So I think the very simple answer is we fundamentally don't believe that folders are actually going to be the predominant method of organizing information in 2030. And in fact, I think we're going to look upon folders like we do floppy disks today. And if you really think about how folders developed, first of all, it was something computer folders and files were developed in the 1950s, and it was completely skeuomorphic. It was basically just looking at the file systems that people had, that maybe you still see at your dentist's office, with all of these little cabinets. And people just said, okay, cool. Now we have these digital things, these things that we call computers. What's the way that we know how to organize information today? Why don't we actually just do the exact same thing and just throw it in a digital realm? And the thing that fundamentally makes Mem different is that our perspective from the very beginning is that there's no one who, I think the prom example is a perfect one, right? No one thinks about prom as, prom is, which folder does prom live in? Is it my high school folder? Is it my embarrassing moments folder? Is it my first crush, my date? Like, which folder, right? And if you think about it that way, that is just a very unnatural way to actually think about and manage information. And that's just been the default way of organizing for all of the digital tools that we use. So the most important thing, first of all, and I would say there's other products that are also in this category, is we just don't believe in folders. Now, how are we different from other companies and products in this category is that we believe that over time, the best organization system requires you to organize the least. And it's something that starts off by helping you organize, as not completely doing it all for you, right?
Sailing kids.
But by actually helping you,
French Polynesia.
No worries. But by actually helping you, by helping you organize, almost as essentially an assistant would, and then eventually progressing towards more and more of this world, you just throw information in here. And this is one of the core things we think about in Mem all the time. How can we just let people start with a piece of information they actually want to capture, and then think about where do I want this to go? How do I want this to be associated later? Whereas every other organization system forces you to think, okay, cool, where does this go before I start writing this down. And that is just a huge mental block, I think, for a lot. It was for me.
Totally. Yeah. It's funny. Just so you guys know, the prom example was basically Dennis asking me to, I ended up writing a post about the benefits for knowledge workers and creators. And initially we started with sex, and Dennis was like, can you put a more PG version of this together? Because that was like, it just, that's where the spark went off in my head. I was like, okay, if you ask people to make a list of all the people they've ever wanted to have sex with, they'd have no problem coming up with that list. It would be like, all right, you don't go through folders of, hey, here's the, sex folder. Here's the list of people I wanted to have sex with. Here's the file for the person I want to have sex with. And Dennis, good example. We need something a little bit more PG for our blog. So then I basically changed it to prom. But let's open this up to questions. So Dan and I were actually just talking before, and he had some questions for you. Dan, you want to just come on and ask a question?
Yeah, sure. I typed one question, but following up on what Dennis said, Dennis, by the way, very impressive product. You just said that it's something that you can throw information into without worrying about how you're going to use it later. But don't you have to? If you're going to tag it, you have to somehow have a preconceived notion of how you might use it later so that you're able to tag it. And in certain situations, you may realize, or you may not realize, that there's a nugget in your information, but had you not tagged it at the time, are you really going to be able to find it?
First of all, I couldn't agree more. I think so. So that's why the way that we think about tags, it's definitely evolved over time. I think the very first thought we had is that you shouldn't even tag anything. If you follow the evolution of the product, it's been interesting because for the longest time, we avoided putting any tags in the sidebar. And the reason was because we don't want people to think of this product as, oh, like I have to use tags. I have to think of something. So the first thing I'll say is that the natural end state of where we're going is you will not have to tag anything, is that you just write and you don't have to think about any of those things. And emergent tags emergent organization will happen automatically. And they won't be called tags, they'll be called topics. We'll essentially imagine a system that is automatically extracting topics, organizing the information for you, or helping you do that without you actually having to say, this is explicitly linked to that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
AI, I assume?
Yes. But I think in the absence of that, or as we work towards that, one of the things that we realized is that, so it's not even in the absence of that, it's in addition to that, the reality is when people have a very clear intent for how they want something to be organized, because sometimes, right? So sometimes you start with this belief where you're like, okay, I have no clue where this should go. I don't care where this should go. I just want to capture this in the moment and hope that I will be able to find this when I actually need it. But then there are other times where you're thinking, I know exactly what this is, and I know exactly how I want to find it, at least one of the ways that I'm going to find it later. And I want to be able to express that to the system that I'm using. And that is how we think about tags today. So it's essentially that bridge where when you do really want to express, hey, this is definitely at least one handle that I want to have into this piece of information, that you can actually do that. But one of the things that we actually measure internally over time is essentially, can we actually decrease the percentage of people who are actually using tags over time? And that's one of the key things that we look at.
So I'll come back to Sydney's question. His is the top, but I want to answer Shelby's question. How does this help with a book or research paper? And I think the actual article that I wrote about the decision advantage folders is actually a perfect example. So I'm going to just share my screen really quick. You can see that whole article literally surfaced out of a conversation. Dennis said one thing to me. It's funny because every time I have a conversation with Dennis, it leads to some new idea that goes into Mem that leads to about 50 other ideas, which I'm sure makes him very happy. But you can see here that these were just random thoughts put together. So you saw the final version of that article. What you didn't see is that article was basically put together using a series of other notes that were already inside of Mem, one by one. I remember there was Dennis asked me once, he's like, how does this help you? He's like, why do you use our product? I said, because it helps me be more creative. And he said, and I said, I'm a storyteller. He's like, how does this help you tell stories? And that was in an hour, I wrote basically a shitty first draft of an article, which you can find a video of this on YouTube. I had to do it as a time lapse because it would be mind numbing to watch me do this. And I sent it to Dennis. I was like, okay, this is how I did. And then I sent it to him as a time lapse. He's like, I'm not going to make you watch, me going through Mem for an hour. That sounds even boring to somebody who created the product. But you'll see here, you'll notice here that every one of these is basically linked. So Shelby, to answer your question, where this really starts to help you with things like research papers and books, is really, it's built on the foundation of taking smart notes. The Sanke Aaron's book, which if you haven't read that, we recorded an interview with him. We haven't aired it yet. You'll hear that on the podcast soon. But it basically makes it easy to connect your ideas together. That first draft was horrible. It was just, hey, Dennis, here's the benefits of Mem for knowledge workers and creators. I'm like, give me a week and I'll refine it. Obviously, it's not good. But the fact that I could have the foundation of it done in probably 35 minutes, keep in mind, I had 2 glasses of wine, and I'll spare you the details of what else I was doing. But I wasn't sober. Let's just put it that way. And I was able to do that. And I sent that video to Dennis, and he was like, wow, okay, cool. So Shelby, hopefully that kind of answers your question. It's really, to me, it's interesting because Dan and I were just doing a consult and he was asking about tags. And I said, I don't actually think of tags as the purpose of tags for me is to connect things. I don't actually use it to tag by topic. Topics are very rarely something I think about. So for example, I have Unmistakable Creative Podcast. I'm like, okay, I want transcripts. I have all these stuff. So Tiago Forte, I mentioned, has this really great article on his blog about tagging for knowledge management. And I think that tags and links, bidirectional links, are probably the 2 most misunderstood things about tools like yours until people get it's what I call the critical mass of knowledge. And the way I described it, and I don't know if I've told this to you, Dennis, like I realized what you're doing is you're applying network effects to information instead of people.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the things that we talked about a lot is if you think about how our brain processes information, when you learn a new piece of knowledge and you absorb that into your brain, it actually has exponential benefits because it creates connections between itself and all of the other nodes that already exist. And it's not a linear function where it's, one more piece of knowledge and you're like just very slightly smarter or more knowledgeable. You actually become much more knowledgeable, and it follows this exponential curve. But the interesting thing about how these existing systems work and the systems that we've come to rely on is that it has the opposite effect, right? The more information that you actually put in something that, let's just say something with a fuller structure or many of the tools that we use today, it actually becomes harder to find that thing. And therefore you actually run into this problem where it becomes exponentially less useful. And the thing that we're fundamentally changing, right, is how do we act? We know something that already works, right? Our brain clearly already works in this way. We just lack memory. The problem with our brains is that we remember things for very short periods of time, unless it's like some very distinct thing and that's like associated with something else. So how can we actually bring how our brain works, which is by association, by linking to different things, into actually this organization system?
Sydney has a question. Sydney, do you mind coming on audio just so we can make sure I clarify your question? Because I know you have a question about para as well as a couple other things.
Yeah, I think there are 2 separate questions. I think one of which, I think I like your point of you mentioning that getting tags and bidirectional linking is wrong. And yeah, I think I want to sort of dive a little bit more into that. And I think that kind of connects to like my question on struggling with tags and reviewing stuff, right? When do I use it as a tag? When do I use it as a bidirectional link? I'm still struggling with that. And yeah, what do you think of the para system, right? Since you don't look at using folders, what is your alternative to do that? And I think the second item I was asking about is, I think I use Rome research, where you can remind yourself in a future date, like on 18 October, I want to see this particular note. I'm unable to do this with Mem. So looking forward to see any hacks or tips that you have.
So I think going back to how I was describing tags earlier, I think the key is you basically, at least this is how I use it. And this is how our team uses it as well. You only use a tag if there is, so let's say, there's like there's an employee contract, and that's something that we want to save, right? So you only use a tag if you know that, hey, I definitely want to be able to find it when I search for contracts or when I search for employment contracts or whatever. And therefore, like, I know when I have an idea of exactly how I'm going to access that information in the future, and I want to guarantee that is a way that I can find this, that is the only time that I ever use tags. I never use tags otherwise. And otherwise, and this is the promise of Mem, is by just typing information in, I'll be able to actually find it because we'll actually understand the semantic meaning of what you're writing. And then therefore, when you actually do search for it, however you remember it by whatever association you can think of, we'll be able to pull that up. So maybe that's based on the location, which is why in our mobile app, one of the things that we're going to launch is automatically attaching the location to whatever note you're in, et cetera, whatever, all of these things. But it's basically all about attaching these contexts that represent the reality that exists today automatically for you. And the tag is just there for when you have a different way that is only in your brain, a context that is specifically in your brain, and a handle that you definitely want to be able to actually reach that information with. And then in terms of bidirectional links, which is really just linking to things, it's when you want to be able to actually, it's essentially like you're typing and in the flow of what you're writing, without having to change your grammatical structure of the sentence, you want to actually link to a concept. It might be a stub that you want to fill out later. Srini, I know that's a popular way that you do it, and a lot of people a lot of people do it. Or it might just be like, hey, I want to link to this particular concept to make sure that these two things are linked, and in a way such that it would not otherwise be obvious to the system that, hey, these two things should be linked. So I would say those are the two things. And then in terms of reminders, I don't know if there's actually a way to essentially snooze a mem today. And then so you can snooze a mem from either inside the mem or from the inbox view. And then you can actually just type in natural language, hey, in 2 weeks or 8 p.m. on Sunday, and it will come back to you.
Yeah, I think that bidirectional links are interesting because it's funny you mentioned. So the way I described it, I basically took Sunk Aaron's book and rewrote it in my own words, and it was like spontaneous insight without immediate action. Because particularly for creative people, like the whole process of doing creative work is not linear. And everybody knows, like, you have ideas are born out of ideas because ideas basically just have sex with each other. New ideas are the offspring of other ideas. So it's that whole Steve Jobs thing of connecting the dots looking backwards. But what you're doing here is you're creating dots. And we have a new version of the course coming out, and almost all of it was literally built from the notes that were in the MEM database, some of them which I'd captured months ago. And I think that's one sort of hurdle that a lot of people have to overcome is, wait a minute, I'm going to capture a note, but I'm going to put nothing in it. The other thing I think that is really powerful is contextual memory, because often you'll have an idea, you'll jot it down, and you might be thinking, hey, you'll jot it down and then you're like, what is this idea about? Why did I have it? But the beauty of bidirectional links is exactly what sparked that thought. And that to me, like I think I did a video about why bidirectional links basically are the end of writer's block, is you'll never have a shortage of ideas. Like when I don't know what to write, I mean, nowadays it's almost never an issue. Like I just go into Mem and scroll through. Oh, here's an idea. Let me write about this for a few minutes. I don't know how I'll use it in the future, but if you've read any of my articles in the last I've been using Mem for a year, but it was really in the last 6 months when I'd hit that sort of tipping point of, oh, I've got 50 notes in here. That's when it clicked. I very distinctly remember it was a Friday night. I was stoned. I'd smoked like 2 joints and I was like, this is like the Matrix for your brain. I'm like, holy shit. It took a little bit of time before it clicked, but when it did, I was just like, oh my God. Now,
I think that's one of the really important things that we really care about, which is if you had done that, you probably feel completely opposite if you had done that in something like Evernote, where you would hit 50 notes and you'd be like, oh my God, in a folder, and you'd be like, oh, yeah, this is a disaster.
Yeah. Well,
right?
the interesting thing is, right, like you start, and Banu and I were actually having a conversation about this. I was like, what I realized that was so different was that when you organize information this way, everybody talks about personal knowledge management. I'm like, wait a minute, we're knowledge workers. Our job is to generate knowledge, not to manage and store it. I'm like, this is a knowledge generation system, not a knowledge management system. The amount of ideas that I've come up with and the amount of blog posts, like there's no shortage of things that I could be doing and working on at any given time now. Like that, honestly, like Mem is like an oxygen supply to my creative work at this point. I can't, like, it's critical to the way that I work. And one of the things I want to have Banu come here and talk about that for a second, but I want to address something because I actually still haven't wrapped my head around this. How do you guys deal with collaboration at Mem? Because I was getting really fed up, like with one of my community managers. In fact, we ended up writing an email about this, about bottlenecks and workflow. I'm like, I can't have you texting me and email me. I'm a person with ADD. Do you know how crazy this drives me? That is literally why I'm doing everything I can to spend like 80 to 90% of my day in Mem. Like, I bet if I looked at my time spent, you probably have those stats, but I would assume that I spent
We actually don't track that for very specific.
Dan had a question about privacy anyway. So like, when I talk, but I noticed that I don't use, I do everything I can to make sure that the only app I'm using is Mem. And I'm like, every time I find myself like, all right, I am using something other than Mem. How do I get this into Mem so I don't have to deal with it elsewhere?
Yeah. So first of all, the reason we don't track time spent is because our philosophy is that if we're doing our job right, that you should essentially be spending less time finding what you need and more time doing, and whether that's inside of Mem or it's outside of Mem. So it's an anti-pattern for us to think about it in terms of time spent. Obviously, we're not upset at you for spending a lot of time inside of Mem, but it's a very intentional decision to not track that. In terms of how people like collaborate and all of that, I think there's some very interesting case studies. Interestingly enough, there's this 100+ person biotech company, and there's actually a few biotech companies. And if you really think about biotech, it's one of the most pure forms of knowledge work that exists out there. You have these people who, have a lot of people with PhDs, very specialized knowledge. And the goal of a biotech organization is to figure out how can you actually create the correct cross-pollination between the right nodes within your organization, such that you can come up with, crazy novel theories and then execute on those things. And there's quite a few biotech customers. And one of the things that they talk about a lot is this concept of latent knowledge, right? So within an organization, you have all of this latent knowledge where, let's say you have a person A and person B, and person A knows a lot about compounds, a particular compound, because they did their PhD on it, their whole lives on it. They did previous research and experiments on that compound. And then there's person B who knows about a different compound. And then there's person C who's thinking about, okay, cool, I'm running an experiment. I'm going to run an experiment that's going to cost us like 400 grand or more, like millions of dollars. And I have to make a decision between whether or not I use compound A or compound B. And that is, of course, like one of an extremely high stakes decision. And imagine being able to just connect those. And when you have it in a knowledge graph format and you have links between person A to compound A, person B to compound B, and then person C who's considering compound A and B, it becomes very clear, why don't we just tell person C to talk to person A and person B? And how do we bring those people together in the same room? So the same, if you actually think about collaboration, the single player experience is when enough time has passed is really just another form of collaboration. It's as if you are collaborating with your past self, because chances are you actually have completely forgotten what you were thinking and how you had decided to organize a piece of information at that point in time, right? So there's a lot of really interesting analogies there. And that's why we actually think, and it's becoming more and more proven, that Mem is, awesome in an individual context, but it's even better and way more magical when you're surfacing information to someone that they never even knew was there in the first place.
Yeah. Okay. Gerald has a question. Gerald, I'll get to your question here in just a second. But Bridget and Chris, would you guys mind actually just coming on audio, even if you don't want to be on camera, because you have questions about collaboration that I'm still trying to answer. Like one thing I haven't figured out is how to deal with tasks in collaboration. I know, like I finally got my community manager was like, listen, I don't want to edit any documents outside of Mem. I was like, if we're doing anything writing related, it has to happen in Mem. Because I can't, like as an ADD person, the lack of context shifts in Mem has literally been the ultimate godsend. But Chris and Bridget, both of you have had questions about collaboration. I'd love some more clarification if you don't mind hopping on audio or on camera.
Hi, Srini. Yeah, am I on? Can you hear me?
Is this Chris?
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, just with the collaboration, I fully respect that maybe I might be doing it wrong. You obviously put the @ symbol, and I've got my business partner, who's funnily enough my wife as well. We are trying to collaborate on projects, but I'm just trying to say this particular task in this particular entire Mem only relates to you, but it'll end up populating, the entire project in her inbox when is a bit clouded. It's too much information. So to the point where I'm trying to run 2 separate Mems with a task list for her and then a task list for me, and then doing bidirectional links between those 2 so we can toggle back in between the 2. When clearly, would it not be just easier to go line by line? That relates to my partner, this one relates to me. Yeah. If I'm doing it wrong, or it's not set up.
Not doing it wrong. This is definitely a limitation of the product today, which is it's basically, there's a few things. One, it's the notification system doesn't give the sender enough customizability. But I think what you're really alluding to is it's basically it's an all or none notification, right? It's the entire mem is like the modular component, and you're notifying on that entire thing rather than a sub component of the mem, et cetera, all of that. So that's also definitely something that we're planning to look into.
Cool.
Thanks for that.
Bridget, what about you? I know you had a question about collaboration. I'd love to hear your question too.
Yeah, thanks so much. I have just been diving into Mem, and it's changed a lot of how I think about a lot of things. I work with a lot of teams that are into a lot of different systems, and I'm just wondering, how do you get people to start to buy into this idea when they have information all over the place that this is like another thing?
I basically I literally just share memes. If you communicate with me email, I'm not going to talk to you, but that's obnoxious. So I'll let Dennis take it. But I literally have found myself like more and more, every time somebody sends me an email, I forward it to Mem and share it with them.
Yeah, I think that is, that's something that we've been thinking about a lot since the very beginning, which is we have all of this information that's scattered across all of these different places. And what we don't want them to become is another place where some siloed piece of information exists. And this is why very early on, and we're planning to make more investments into this in the future, but very early on, we decided to launch an API that actually allowed people to bring information in. And the way that we think about Mem, there's also kind of other adapters that exist today. So for example, you can connect your calendar and then you can create events that are automatically linked to your calendar. We actually recently launched imports that lets you, bring information in from other places. And one of the really interesting things that we'll do with imports, rather than just like pulling it in and saying, okay, here's the thing, is actually then, how that collides with the rest of the system, right? What if we can import information and then immediately after show you, oh, by the way, these are connections that we found between your past pieces of information that you probably never knew existed, and bring essentially all of that in. So basically, our thesis is that you really need all of this information in one place. And in order to do that, either we have to build all of the surface area where you can do everything inside of them, or we make it very easy for you to integrate those things, right? To connect those things. And the second path is definitely the preferred path, but there are some things that have to just be, native within the product. For example, like tasks, right? This is something that we've talked about for a long time, but the way that tasks work today in the product is actually nowhere close to where we ideally want it to be. And we think it should actually be much more of a first-class citizen, whereas right now it's an afterthought.
Yeah, I noticed that I don't do team tasks in Mem. I have another tool for managing a team, but like as far as routing information, like every single time if I do something more than 3 times that requires me to go to another tool, I'm like, all right, how do I get this into Mem? And so I've done some pretty fun stuff. Like so far now I have, I have Alexa set up to send things to Mem. Like I literally because if you're a creative person, you wait, like mornings are really precious as a creative person, and if you don't jot those ideas down, I'm sitting in my bed sometimes, I'm like, hey Alexa, tell Zapier to trigger a zap, send an idea to Mem. And because every creative person knows, like you wake up in the morning, you're like, oh, that's a really good idea, I should write about that. And of course you forget it. And I remember even Meili, who was on the customer success team at Mem, she's, wait, connected your Alexa to Mem? Yes. She's like, how the hell did you do that? I was like, oh, here's a zap. I'm like, here's a copy of it. Yeah. So Gerald actually asked, this is my shameless pitch. We just did a massive update. Like literally I've spent the entire day doing this, which is why I barely talked to Dennis on Mem today. So Gerald asks, how do I learn to use Mem? How much does it cost and all of that? So if you go to maximizeyouroutput.com, you can see that I stole a lot of Apple ideas, like literally stole the font from them. And I literally was on the Apple website half of the night last night looking, how do these guys organize information to make it so simple? So we're actually launching a cohort-based version of Maximize Your Output, because I realized after just seeing the completion rates, I know Sydney's in the self-paced version of the course, and he actually emailed me, he's like, hey, where's my login? And then in the last couple of days, he went through 5 or 6 modules. I'm not trying to call you out, Sydney, but so I realized that part of the challenge with this is that it is so counterintuitive that I thought, all right, I decided one that I wanted to redo the course because I think I created the course probably a month or two after I started using Mem, thinking, oh, cool, like I have an idea. Let me see what happens. And now my knowledge of it has evolved quite a bit in terms of using the product. And Dennis can attest to my use of the product up to the point where I'm sitting here on Christmas Eve talking to him about something I'm trying to struggle with Mem. So this goes much deeper than any of the YouTube tutorials that I've ever done. And the reason I wanted to do a cohort was because I saw firsthand the difference between when I actually was able to see what people were doing and explain things to them versus when I had to basically just say, hey, here's a module. And of course, anybody who's taking a course knows, hey, you log it. Sometimes you forget you even buy the damn thing. And so cohort is actually starting. And just to give you a sneak peek of that, one of my friends from college, the guy who was an AI engineer, and if you're on our email list, you'll get an email about this with a video. But when I showed him what was possible, he said, I think he showed me one task, and this was one feature in Mem, which was Spotlight. And he said, I think it was like he was copying and pasting emails from Evernote, tasks to Asana, meeting notes from emails. And I was like, I want to shoot myself just watching this. And so I showed him Mem Spotlight, and he looked at me and he said, I feel like you've upgraded my life. And I was like, yeah, I'm like, you're an AI engineer. You should not be spending time doing this. Like, you got a PhD from Berkeley in AI computer science. Like, you should go get a job at Mem. But it was mind-boggling to me that somebody that's like I said, Bailey, your customer success person, I was like, Mem basically helps smart people stop spending their time doing stupid things. And she's like, I'm going to share that with the team. I was like, feel free to, because it's true. It's amazing how much I've tried so many tools. And keep in mind, I deal with a volume of information, as I mentioned earlier, that is way higher than probably most of you, because I'm dealing with navigating podcast guests, reading their books, my own writing, a YouTube channel, and a team of 4 people. And in 10 years, this was hands down the best tool that I don't even think of it as a tool anymore. This is just an extension of me at this point. It's more than a second brain in my mind. So yeah, Gerald, to answer your question, we'll be sending out emails about this tomorrow, but the maximize your output, I'll share the screen and I'll include a link and send all that to you guys. But you can see here, and there'll be a few updates to the site, but it starts on Monday of next week. I just realized the thing that's really difficult with trying to explain a lot of this just in videos by yourself is that when you're watching them by yourself is that you're left to your own devices. Whereas the difference between the cohort and the self-paced version will still be available. And I know some of you have already enrolled in that. And I literally just finished recording 4 modules today. So those will be available and the rest will be there probably by the end of the weekend. The reason I decided to re-record the course was just because my knowledge had evolved so much from when I first started using it. And as you can see, mainly the customer success person at Mem actually accredited me for getting her job at Mem. I remember once I showed her how to do something with a combination of Zapier and Mem, and she was like, I should give you half my paycheck. I was like, no, you should tell Dennis to give me an equity stake in the company. I was like, because honestly, I've never been this gung-ho about a product. Keep in mind, I talk to thousands and thousands of people every day. Like, we're talking endless amounts of pitches from potential podcast guests. And I can tell you, I have no previous relationship with Dennis. We don't know each other. I just absolutely fell in love with what this made possible. As a knowledge worker and as a creative, I'd never seen something that allowed me to do this. And just so you know, all of this content that you see on this landing page, I created most of this in less than 2 days, in addition to the 5 or 6 emails for the launch sequence. And that's all possible because of what I already had inside of it. So Shelby, to answer your question, how does this help you write research papers? Much faster. It's really, honestly, the best. I've tried literally everything. And yeah, I'm telling you, I've never seen anything quite like this. I'm going to pass it over to Banu because there's a bias here because I'm selling a course. I want somebody who's not trying to sell you something to talk about this. Banu, are you on audio?
Yeah.
Because Banu and I have had a lot of chats, and Banu is like a very skilled software developer. So he and I, like, every time I get stuck, I contact him. I'm like, hey, how do I fix this?
Yeah, thanks, Srini. I mean, it's been, I think, about 7 to 8 months and now using Mem. I'm a big fan of both the product and Srini, your productivity system as well. I resonate very well with 2 things that you both mentioned, Dennis and Srini. One is Mem becoming a relationship manager between your current self and the past self, because I am realizing that every day as it passes, because I use like 10 other tools prior to this. I have never been so enthusiastic to start dumping data, whatever that comes to my mind, even if it should just dump it there, because sometime down the line, that is going to come surface back to me and say, okay, this is useful for you today. So that's how it is working to me as a relationship manager. And number two, in collaboration with other teams, which Srini was pointing out earlier. At my work, I use Mem. I started to use at work recently. And when my team members from different team or different locations start sharing content, I started pasting in Mem and sharing them, Mems to them directly. They have been using different systems, and our office doesn't support accessing Mem directly. But on their browsers and their personal systems, when they start accessing Mem, they say, this is something that we'll have to get access in our office, because there are so many like SharePoint, all that nonsensical tools there, where we end up trying to search half the time than actually doing the work. Now, Mem is surfacing the information for them real quick. As soon as I start typing, oh, I want to check about this product, it surfaces the information for the entire team, and they're so happy using this tool. I'm so glad that I got associated with this tool very early, and been big fan of it, Dennis, and really big fan of it. And like Srini mentioned, I'm happy to like share this and educate about this to as many people as possible. And I've been inviting so many people onto Mem, and at least half of them are now good users of it.
We've basically become, part of Dennis's cult. Yeah, and any good company should be a cult. Like, Unmistakable Creative, as far as I'm concerned, is a cult. I interview cult psychologists because I'm like, what can we learn from a cult? I'm like, you want people who are fanatics. And honestly, like, I'm so fanatical about this product that I sent my literary agent an email saying, I have a new idea for a book called The World Without Folders, because Cal Newport's book is premature. You need a world without folders before you can have a world without email. She didn't respond. At this point, I'm very close to just saying, you know what, I'm going to take pre-orders for the book, and then I'm going to tell my publisher to go to hell. And I could thank Dennis for that. It'll be like, hey, But honestly, like, Banu, we'll have to have it and come and have you as a guest lecturer in the course to teach about integrations, because I took layman's approach to integrations. Bridget asked a question about Airtable, Excel, all that kind of stuff. I've done a few tutorials on how to import data. I can tell you this. I put blog post data into Airtable, imported into Mem, assembled newsletters, that kind of stuff. There's a lot. Like, I think the integration stuff is really, honestly, like, I'm guessing, Dennis, like, we're barely scratching the surface of what's possible, because every day I'm like, how do I get this into Mem so I don't ever have to fucking go into this other tool again? Even tasks, like, funny enough, like, there was a period when I was routing tasks from different task management tools. I was like, okay, people are assigning me bullshit tasks. I'm not going to do this anymore. But yeah, go ahead, Dennis.
There's just one thing on that is, hopefully things will be, pulling information in the Mem will be easier over time. I mean, that's something that we're also actively working on. So right now there's Zapier, there's the API, but obviously we're also building more and more.
What about getting information out? Because you and I have been talking about this. Yeah. You asked me, you're like, what is the most useful thing you could do for you? I was like, give me a way to get my information out, so I never have to like and put into WordPress.
So yeah, that's one of the key pieces of Spotlight, right? Which is if you have your information inside of, you don't actually have to go to Mem to then actually take that information out. And then there's also an export feature, but we're basically, right now we have the write API that allows you to pull information in, and in the future we plan to have a read API as well to allow you to essentially automate a lot of those things. I think one thing on some of the things that you guys have been talking about earlier is a sneak peek for folks here to look forward to. Is there's something that we're planning to release over the next few months that I think will actually be I think it is the biggest thing that we've ever released as a company, and it's essentially this concept of sorry, one sec. We got a call for some reason. It's essentially this concept called similar Mems. And what it'll do is it'll automatically surface Mems, even if you didn't tag them, if you didn't add any links, if you did, any of that stuff, from your space, whether it's been shared with you or written by you, and it'll automatically surface those in the sidebar for every single Mem that actually exists today. Today, you'll see there's like a related Mem section, but that's powered by very explicit linkages that you create. So if you add hashtags, all of that stuff, but we've been testing some of this stuff internally and seeing just the kinds of connections that it can make automatically, and it's incredible. For the use case of being able to surface information from your past to you at the present moment right now, and whatever work you're doing. I think that's going to be a watershed moment for a lot of how you guys use the product.
One thing I'm looking forward to, Dennis, is the read API, because now if you want to publish a blog post or put your information out there on the public space, if you have a read API, it can act as a CMS, and then that's going to be super duper powerful with crazy amount of use cases.
Yeah, definitely. It's coming.
Waiting for it.
So I think the final question was on pricing, which is funny. It's like people are like, what does Mem cost? Like, it's free.
Yeah, basically, because the product is still in beta, it's free for now. And the way that we're thinking about pricing is we'll always have some free tier, and primarily for people who are, using it as individuals who don't have a crazy amount of essentially volume and all of that stuff. And then we're planning on rolling out monetization where there'll be a pro plan, a teams plan, and then kind of other stuff on top of that later this year. So TBD on those exact numbers, but we plan to always have a very generous free plan. And then for more of these power features and power user features, it's going to be more of the typical stuff that you would expect from a subscription.
No. Cool. First off, thank you, Dennis. It's very rare that you can convince somebody who's building a startup that's like basically a rocket ship to be like, hey, spend an hour with one of your users and talk to his audience. And so I think that I can tell you that, like I said, Dennis is the kind of person who literally is answering questions on Slack and literally hopping with me on Zoom to solve my problems on Christmas Eve. I don't know anybody who would do that. Honestly, like, this has been a godsend. That is why I decided to create a course. Like, on one hand, of course, we're running a business to it unmistakable. We want to make money. We want to make profit. And part of the reason that I ditched Rome was because I remember I took Nat Aliason's Rome course and I hated the interface. I was like, I wish this was easier to use. And then I discovered Mem, and I was like, that's it. I'm going to basically take everything I learned from what Nat Aliason talked about in Rome and going to apply it to Mem. And I mean, honestly, I can tell you I spend probably the bulk of my day inside of Mem. And it has been like the other day, I remember I was talking to a friend via text message, and I literally just pulled a Mem, I was explaining something to him, was like, hold on just a second. I pulled a quote using Spotlight and posted it into a text message. But yeah, so just so you know, as I mentioned, sorry, let me pull this up really quick. And I will definitely send out an email about this tomorrow. We're doing some major updates on this. There'll be, for those of you who have taken the self-paced version of the course, new modules are going to be available tomorrow. Most of the rest of them will be done by the weekend. But if you go to maximizeyouroutput.com, you can actually see all of the details. The cohort starts next. And like I said, if you're in the cohort, you'll get everything that's in the self-paced modules, as well as 7 live sessions, asynchronous coaching, and workflow automation templates. We'll probably have to have Banu come in and actually do a guest lecture for workflow automation. I thought I knew about automation. I didn't even think to that until Banu showed up. I was like, yeah, we should have Banu come in and actually be my co-host for that lecture. There is some really cool stuff that you can do in terms of automation. Right now, I have all my bills go directly to Mem. I have emails from certain people go to Mem. Like, I use Alexa to capture ideas inside of it. Really, honestly, is an extension of my life at this point, not even an extension of my second brain. In fact, I would say that with Mem, you're not building a second brain, you're building a second you. Any final questions? If not, we'll let Dennis get back to work, and I need to do the same because I probably have a few more content, a bit of modules to record, as well as it's my sister's anniversary, which I just realized because I got on Facebook. Too bad Mem didn't remind me of that.
Dennis, fascinating product. It's going to be fun watching it evolve. Well done. Thanks, Srini.
Thank you, Dan.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dennis, for joining us. This has been awesome. And if you have any questions about the cohort, please feel free to email me. Just shoot an email to hello@unmistakablemedia.com. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to spreading the word.
Thanks for having me, Srini.
Absolutely.
See you, folks.
All right, guys. Take care.